The new i5-10600K is a very important CPU for Intel because it finally addresses the major shortcoming that Intel's i5 processors had, and that's the lack of hyperthreading. So finally we have 12 processing threads as opposed to the usual 6. And the reason that this is so important is because this is the main reason that gamers and those looking to do maybe a bit of video editing on a budget would instead go for a Ryzen 5 CPU, which does have 12 total processing threads. Not only does that give you more multi-threading performance in things like rendering and encoding, but it also gives you a more stable gaming experience as well. But now it's time to see who really has the better 6-core mainstream gaming CPU, now that the 10600K does have that hyperthreading enabled. And if you're looking to build a gaming PC quite soon, this is definitely a video that you do not want to miss. Now, just as with the 10900K that we reviewed yesterday, these new 10th generation CPUs from Intel are still on the 14nm manufacturing process. In simple terms, what that means to the consumer is that most of the performance gains that we're going to be seeing here are from an increase in thread count and the higher clock speed, not an improvement in the silicon underneath. In the case of the i5-10600K, it has both higher clock speeds and a higher thread count than its predecessor, the 9600K, yet at the same price of around $260 US. Now, although AMD's fan favorite Ryzen 5 3600 is a direct competitor to this CPU, it's around $60 cheaper and comes with an included CPU cooler. A not very good CPU cooler, but at least it does offset the cost between these two CPUs and is definitely worth noting. There's a difference when it comes to motherboards as well, with the 10600K requiring a Z490 motherboard if you want to overclock the CPU or run a memory kit beyond 2666 MHz, and that'll set you back around $150 at the very minimum. A comparable AMD B450 motherboard, which will overclock the Ryzen processor and memory kit just fine, can be had for around $50 to $70 less. Those differences do start to add up, making the real price difference between these two CPUs a bit closer to $150 depending on which hardware you buy, and that's more than enough to upgrade something like your GPU. We will talk more about this towards the end, but let's make our way into the benchmarks. First off, when it comes to longer, heavier workloads like rendering, the i5-10600K will settle to 4.5 GHz on all 6 cores, whereas for gaming, you'll see it closer to 4.7 to 4.8. Just keep these numbers in mind when we visit overclocking in just a minute. So jumping right into the production workloads, we see an unfamiliar sight, an Intel i5 CPU beating an AMD Ryzen 5 CPU when it comes to tasks like rendering and encoding. Granted, the performance gain over the R5-3600 isn't huge in most tasks like Blender, where we see the two just a few seconds apart, and also in video editing, where the two will basically give you the same performance and editing experience. Undoubtedly though, the i5-10600K is the faster clocked CPU with faster single-threaded performance, so there will be a few tasks, tools, and plugins that will run faster on that 10600K. But where the difference really becomes clear is when we take a look at gaming, where the new i5-10600K is substantially faster than the Ryzen 5 3600. In Far Cry 5, there's a 25% performance difference between them, with the new i5 practically on the heels of the 9700K and 9900K. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order shows a huge 27% performance difference between them, as this game scales tremendously with CPU clock speed, but other games like Red Dead Redemption 2 will show a more modest difference of around 9%. In Overwatch, the Ryzen 5 CPU isn't fast enough to keep up with the 300 frames per second frame cap like the 10600K is, and in Shadow of the Tomb Raider we see a pretty staggering difference between the two yet again of 26%. The 10600K is very close to some of the best gaming CPUs that you can currently buy, and for a $260 CPU, that's seriously impressive. Finally, it looks like we're back to the days where an i5 is all you need for gaming, even if you're looking to push some seriously high frame rates. But the 10600K has another advantage over the Ryzen 5 3600, and that's more overclocking headroom. Whereas the 3600 can be overclocked to 4.2 to 4.3 GHz at the very most, I was able to stretch the 10600K all the way up to 5 GHz on all 6 cores at 1.35 volts, and at this point you can pretty much close the gap between between it and a stock i9-10900K. Keep in mind though that to achieve that overclock, you will need at least a better than average Z490 motherboard and some decent CPU cooling, but there's no reason why you couldn't overclock to something more modest like 4.8 GHz and still get a decent bump in performance with a cheap motherboard and CPU cooler. Now, some of you might remember a gaming build I did late last year for my little brother, and seeing as this was a bit more of a mainstream build, the CPU option then was very clear. There was no way I was going with Intel's i5-9400 or 9600K with only 6 threads when the Ryzen 5 3600 gave double the thread count and in many cases an objectively better gaming experience. But if I was doing that build today, my choice would be very different because now the objectively better performing CPU is the i5-10600K. CPU clock speed still proves to be the primary driver when it comes to gaming performance for CPUs, and that's something that might never change. Now, if you do go for the KF variant, which means that you won't be getting an integrated GPU within the processor, something that the R5-3600 doesn't have anyway, you can close that price gap a little more that we mentioned earlier. Although that still means that the effective price difference between the 10600K and 3600 is around $100, but here's why I think the 10600K is the better choice. Although you can use that saved $100 or so to upgrade your GPU and then get faster gaming performance, the 10600K is the CPU that can outlive future GPU upgrades, whereas the Ryzen 5 3600 might end up bottlenecking your system down the road. If you are a bit more budget conscious though, and you don't really like the idea of spending the extra cash on the i5-10600K, instead of getting an R5 3600, do consider one of the new Intel i3 CPUs or the new Ryzen 3300X. We'll have a video comparing those two quite soon, and those are significantly cheaper. Personally, I think the i5-10600K is one of the best CPUs in Intel's current 10th generation desktop CPU lineup because, as I mentioned in the intro, it addresses the biggest problem within their product stack with the most popular kind of SKU of processors that people are going to be buying. Finally, by adding hyperthreading, a small bump in clock speed, and then keeping the price the same as previously, they are bringing some serious competition to AMD's Ryzen 5 CPUs. If I was personally building a mainstream gaming PC today, the 10600K is definitely my first pick there. There's kind of no question in my mind. And I know the kind of counter argument to that is, well, it's $100 more expensive than the R5 3600, so it's not really a fair comparison. But instead, again, instead of going for the R5 3600 there, I would go for a cheaper CPU. I would go for the 3300X, or I would go for an Intel i3. So definitely wait until we compare those two before you make your decision there. The reason for that is that the 3300X actually performs fairly similar to the 3600. So just keep that in mind. As some perspective, there's no reason why you couldn't pair a 10600K with a 2080 Super or 2080 Ti, but that's not something that I would recommend with a Ryzen 5 3600 unless you're gaming at really low frame rates and high resolutions. So that about wraps things up. If you are interested in picking up the 10600K or any of these other CPUs that I recommend, I will leave them linked down below in the description. As always, guys, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.